The small, suburban town of Pine Hollow had always been quiet, peaceful. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where children played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and neighbors exchanged polite smiles as they tended to their gardens. It was the perfect place for someone like Lily Carter to settle down after her recent move from the city. Lily had found the house at the edge of town, modest, with white shutters and a picket fence that creaked in the wind. The small garden out front was overgrown, and the paint was peeling in places, but it was home. It was a fresh start, far from the chaos she'd left behind. Her neighbor, Mrs. Everly, lived in the house next door. Mrs. Everly was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, with silver hair and a permanent smile that seemed a little too perfect. She always wore flowered dresses, and there was a softness to her voice that made her sound harmless. In fact, she was the epitome of a sweet, kindly neighbor. At least that's what Lily thought at first. It had started a few weeks ago. Mrs. Everly had introduced herself with a basket of freshly baked cookies and a warm handshake. They exchanged pleasantries, and Mrs. Everly invited Lily over for tea the following weekend. It seemed innocent enough, a friendly gesture, something expected in a town like Pine Hollow. But something about the house next door felt off. Lily had been spending more time in her new home, unpacking boxes and getting settled, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Everly was always watching. It wasn't overt, just a lingering glance when Lily was outside, or the soft rustling of curtains when she looked out her own window. At first, Lily thought it was just her imagination. After all, she'd never been the most social person and sometimes felt like she was being overly paranoid. But then things started to change. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. Lily had just returned from the grocery store and was unloading bags when she noticed Mrs. Everly standing at the edge of her yard, staring intently at Lily's house. It wasn't unusual for Mrs. Everly to be in her garden, but this was different. She was motionless, eyes fixed on Lily's front door, as though she was waiting for someone. Lily waved, hoping to break the unsettling silence. Mrs. Everly smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Lovely day, isn't it, dear?" she called, her voice soft but slightly strained. "I was just admiring your porch. Such a charming little spot." Lily smiled back, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine. "Thank you, Mrs. Everly. It's my favorite spot, too." But as she turned back to the door, she caught a glimpse of something strange. Mrs. Everly's gaze didn't move. She was still watching, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Lily hesitated, then quickly stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Over the next few days, the odd behavior continued. Lily would hear strange noises at night, soft tapping sounds that seemed to come from the walls, just faint enough that she could almost convince herself it was the house settling. But it wasn't always the house. Sometimes, when the wind was still and the house was silent, she could hear whispers, voices faint and indecipherable, like the sound of someone talking just on the other side of the wall. The more she listened, the more she realized it wasn't just random noise. It was coming from next door. Lily tried to shrug it off. It could be anything: pipes, the trees rubbing against the window, the creaking of the old house. But when she mentioned it to Mrs. Everly the next time they crossed paths, the older woman's response was too quick, too practiced. "Oh, the house is very old, dear. It has its quirks," Mrs. Everly had said, her smile never faltering. Nothing to worry about, but Lily wasn't so sure. The breaking point came one evening when Lily returned home late after a long day of work. She was exhausted and looking forward to a quiet night in. But as she pulled into her driveway, she noticed a light in Mrs. Everly's window. It was bright, too bright, like a lamp left on for hours. But what caught Lily's attention was the shadow she saw flitting behind the curtain. A large figure moving rapidly back and forth, its outline just visible in the dim light. The shape didn't look like Mrs. Everly. It was too tall, too unnatural. Lily felt her heart race as she parked the car and grabbed her bag. Something wasn't right. She tried to shake the feeling off as she approached her front door, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up. When she reached the door, she paused and glanced over at Mrs. Everly's house again. The shadow was gone. Lily couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over her as she entered her house and locked the door behind her. She couldn't explain it, but something told her that Mrs. Everly's house wasn't what it seemed. There was a secret buried beneath that harmless facade. The next morning, Lily decided to confront it. She waited until late afternoon, when the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. With a deep breath, she crossed the yard and knocked on Mrs. Everly's door. There was no answer. The door was ajar just slightly, as if it had been left that way on purpose. Lily hesitated but pushed the door open, calling out, "Mrs. Everly? Are you home?" The silence was unnerving. She stepped inside, her footsteps soft against the creaky floorboards. The house smelled of stale air and something else. Something faintly metallic like rust or old blood. Lily shivered, her senses heightened. She moved cautiously, her gaze scanning the rooms. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the distant sound of something scraping against the walls. She crept toward the stairs, her breath quickening with every step. As she reached the top, she glanced down the hallway, where a faint light flickered under one of the doors. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The door swung open with a groan. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old books and strange artifacts. But it wasn't the clutter that made Lily's breath catch. It was the sight of a large, wooden trunk sitting in the center of the room. It was old, worn, and covered in a thin layer of dust, but something about it felt wrong. Lily approached the trunk, drawn to it despite the sense of dread that filled her chest. She placed her hand on the lid, her fingers brushing against the cool, weathered wood. Before she could open it, however, she heard a noise behind her. A low, guttural growl. She froze. The air in the room turned cold, the temperature dropping sharply as if something was watching her, waiting. Slowly, Lily turned around. Mrs. Everly stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with something akin to fear. But that wasn't what made Lily's heart stop. It was the dark, twisted smile that slowly spread across her face. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, dear," Mrs. Everly whispered. "You shouldn't have come here." Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in the dimly lit room, her hand still hovering over the trunk. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and every inch of her body screamed for her to leave. But the sight of Mrs. Everly standing in the doorway, that unsettling smile on her lips, kept her rooted to the spot. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "What's in the trunk, Mrs. Everly?" For a moment there was silence. Mrs. Everly's smile faltered, but only for the briefest of moments. Then, her eyes hardened, the warmth that once accompanied her smile disappearing entirely. "You've gone too far, Lily. I told you not to pry into things you don't understand." Lily's mind raced. There was something in that trunk. Something dark, something dangerous. And Mrs. Everly knew it. You're hiding something," Lily said, her voice gaining strength despite the growing fear inside her. "What is it? What are you hiding in there?" Mrs. Everly's lips curled upward again. But this time, it was a smile that carried no kindness, no warmth. It was a smile that spoke of years of secrets, of things best left forgotten. "You should have stayed in the dark, Lily," she said, her voice low, almost a growl. "Some things, once they're uncovered, can never be put back." Lily's fingers tightened around the handle of the trunk. Her curiosity was overwhelming, but so was her fear. Every fiber of her being told her to leave, run as far away as possible. But something kept her there. Something made her want to know the truth. "What's inside?" she asked again, her voice trembling now. For a brief moment, Mrs. Everly was silent. Then, she took a step into the room, her eyes narrowing in warning. "You've seen too much already. You can't go back." Lily took a deep breath and stepped back, feeling a sense of unease like never before. Something was horribly wrong here. She was standing in a stranger's home, facing a woman who, for all intents and purposes, seemed normal, at least at first. But the way Mrs. Everly stood there, blocking the only exit, told a different story altogether. Without thinking, Lily darted toward the door, but Mrs. Everly was faster. Her hand shot out with surprising strength, grabbing Lily's arm and yanking her back into the room. "No," she hissed. "You won't leave until you understand." Lily gasped in pain, but her instinct kicked in. She shoved Mrs. Everly with all her strength, forcing her to stumble back. The older woman didn't seem fazed, though. Her eyes were now wide, her expression colder than ever before. The moment she regained her balance, she rushed toward the trunk. Lily's heart raced as she backed up, keeping her eyes locked on Mrs. Everly. The trunk was still there, beckoning with an almost sinister allure, but Lily didn't know if she could trust anything anymore. "I told you to leave it alone," Mrs. Everly said, her voice shaking with what Lily could only describe as barely contained rage. "You think you can just walk in here, snoop around, and uncover things that aren't meant to be known? You think you're some kind of hero?" Lily took another step back, her mind reeling with the implications of what Mrs. Everly was saying. She wanted to ask more questions, wanted to dig deeper into the mystery that seemed to haunt this house. But something inside her told her that the answers would be more than she could handle. "You don't understand," Mrs. Everly continued, her voice low and strained. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." Lily's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Everly's eyes flickered toward the trunk, and for a brief moment, there was a look of deep sorrow in her eyes, before it was replaced by a cold, steely resolve. She slowly walked toward the trunk, never taking her eyes off Lily. "You want to know what's inside?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "Fine, but you won't be able to leave here the same." With trembling hands, Mrs. Everly reached for the latch on the trunk, her fingers shaking. When the latch clicked open, the room seemed to grow even colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Lily could see her breath in front of her. Mrs. Everly pulled the trunk open with a creak, revealing the contents inside. Lily couldn't help but gasp in horror. The trunk was filled with old books, books that seemed ancient, their leather covers cracked and worn. But they weren't ordinary books. There was something sinister about them. The titles were written in languages Lily couldn't understand, their dark pages seeming to writhe and shift with each passing second. "What are these?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "They're not just books," Mrs. Everly said, her voice almost a whisper. "They're cursed. They hold power, dark power. Power that can change reality itself." Lily's blood ran cold. She had heard stories before of cursed objects, of items that could warp the fabric of time and space, but she had never truly believed them. Until now. "The book you touched," Mrs. Everly said, her voice growing darker. "It was the first one I ever found. The curse inside it is what brought me here, to this house. And now," she looked at Lily, her expression almost pitying. "Now it's too late." Lily took a step back, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" What do you mean, it's too late? The older woman's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a twisted grin. You're already in it, Lily. The curse has taken hold. Before Lily could respond, there was a sharp, jarring noise behind her. A loud thud, followed by the sound of the house groaning as if it were alive. The lights flickered, and the room seemed to shift around her, as if the very walls were closing in. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face Mrs. Everly. But when she looked at the older woman, she didn't see the same face she had seen moments before. The woman standing in front of her was different. Her skin was pale, almost ashen, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. A low, guttural laugh escaped from her throat, sending a chill down Lily's spine. "You've made a terrible mistake," the creature in front of her whispered, and then everything went black. Lily's eyes shot open, and she gasped for breath, her body jerking upright as if she had just awoken from a deep, suffocating sleep. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, the air cold and musty, heavy with the scent of old wood and dampness. She blinked in confusion, trying to make sense of where she was. The room was dark, with only a faint, flickering light coming from a single dim lamp in the corner. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing heavier by the second. The floor beneath her was hard and unforgiving, as though she were lying on the cold, unforgiving stone of a cellar or basement. For a moment, panic surged within her as she realized she wasn't in Mrs. Everly's house anymore. She wasn't even sure how she had gotten here, or how much time had passed since the eerie encounter with the old woman. A wave of nausea washed over her as her memories began to resurface. Of the trunk, the dark books, the horrifying realization that something unnatural had taken hold of her. But there was one memory that stood out above the rest. The face of Mrs. Everly, twisted and monstrous, her eyes glowing with dark power. Lily scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She wiped her sweaty palms against her pants, trying to steady herself. The dark room around her seemed to close in, making it harder to breathe. Panic bubbled up in her chest, but she refused to let it overtake her. She needed to find answers. She had to. As she moved toward the door, her eyes caught a shadow in the corner of the room. Her heart skipped a beat as she froze, her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood in the dark, barely visible in the dim light. "Lily?" A voice called out, soft but clear. She froze in place. The voice was unfamiliar, but somehow comforting in the unsettling darkness. She didn't know whether to run or approach. The voice seemed to come from the shadows, and Lily couldn't make out the figure standing there. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a man standing there. His face was obscured by shadow, but his body language was calm, almost reassuring. Lily couldn't explain why, but something about him felt safe enough to trust, at least for now. "I'm here to help you," the man said softly, his voice laced with concern. "You're not alone in this." Lily's pulse quickened. "What is this place? Where am I?" The man hesitated, his face still hidden from her view. "You're in a place where the curse is strongest. Mrs. Everly. She's not who you think she is. And you," he paused, taking a step toward her. "You've been marked." Lily's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, chilling her to the bone. "Marked? By what?" The man's voice grew more urgent. "By the curse. The book you touched. It's more than just a book. It's a doorway, and now you've stepped through it." Lily's mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. The curse, the book. She had no idea what was happening. All she knew was that she was trapped in some twisted nightmare, and the reality she once knew no longer seemed to exist. What do you mean?" Lily whispered, stepping closer. Why can't I just leave? The man sighed, his voice tinged with sorrow. The curse isn't something you can just walk away from. Once you've been marked, the world around you starts to change. You'll see things, hear things, things that aren't real, but feel terrifyingly real. And the longer you stay in this place, the stronger the curse will become. Lily shook her head, unable to comprehend the magnitude of his words. But I didn't do anything. I just touched the book. It's not just about touching the book, the man interrupted, his voice tight with urgency. It's about what's inside it, what it's capable of. You've unleashed something you can't control. Lily stepped back, her mind swirling with confusion. What are you saying? Am I going to die? The man's expression softened, though his eyes were filled with sadness. I don't know, but I do know that the curse won't let you go unless you confront it. You need to face what's coming. Lily felt her knees weaken as the weight of his words pressed down on her. She had no idea what kind of twisted game she had found herself in, but she knew she had to get out of it before it consumed her entirely. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the darkness beyond the door. Lily's heart leaped in her chest, and the man's face grew tense. "They're here," he said in a whisper, his eyes narrowing. "You have to move now." Before Lily could respond, the door flew open, and a figure stepped into the room, Mrs. Everly. Her once kind, gentle expression was gone, replaced by an eerie, cold smile. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and she stepped toward them with deliberate slowness. "You shouldn't have come here, Lily," Mrs. Everly said, her voice low and chilling. "You should have stayed away." Lily's heart raced, and she instinctively took a step back, her breath shallow with fear. The man beside her stepped forward, blocking her path. "You're too late," the man said firmly. "The curse is already in motion, but I can still stop it. If we work together." Mrs. Everly's smile widened, and she laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Lily's spine. "You think you can stop me? You think you can stop the curse?" The man didn't flinch. "It's not about stopping you. It's about stopping the curse before it takes everything from her." Lily's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. But before she could say anything, a sharp, cracking sound echoed through the room, followed by a low, guttural growl from the shadows. And then, something massive moved behind Mrs. Everly. Something dark, twisting, and monstrous. Lily's stomach turned as the creature's form became clearer, its eyes glowing with the same unnatural light that filled Mrs. Everly's. "The curse," Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "What have I done?" Before anyone could answer, the creature lunged forward, its eyes locked on her with terrifying intent. Lily's body was numb. The darkness was all-encompassing, swallowing her whole as she floated in a void. She could hear nothing but the faint rush of blood in her ears, the sound of her frantic heartbeat reverberating in her chest. Her mind screamed, but her mouth was silent. The last thing she had seen was the creature, the monster that had materialized from the shadows, its glowing eyes locked onto hers with hunger. She had felt its cold breath on her skin before everything went black. When Lily finally awoke, she was lying on the cold floor once again. But this time, it wasn't the damp basement or the musty room. She was back in Mrs. Everly's house. The walls looked the same, but there was something off about them now. Flickering lights, distorted shadows, and a silence that was unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath. Her head throbbed, and her fingers were numb. She sat up slowly, taking in her surroundings, trying to make sense of what had happened. She could still feel the weight of the curse on her chest, like a heavy hand pressing down on her, preventing her from moving freely. It was as if she had never left. Yet, everything felt wrong. Nothing was familiar, even though the place was the same. She stumbled to her feet, her hands shaking as she touched the wall for balance. The air felt thick, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The distant sound of creaking would echo through the house, like the house was alive, breathing with a dark rhythm. She could feel the presence of something or someone watching her. Lily looked around, trying to gather her thoughts, but they kept slipping away like sand through her fingers. What had happened to the man who had tried to protect her? The creature? The last thing she remembered was Lily. Her blood ran cold. The voice. It was unmistakable. The voice that haunted her every waking moment. The voice that had whispered to her in the dark. Mrs. Everly's voice. Lily turned, her heart racing. She saw Mrs. Everly standing in the doorway, her frail body barely visible in the shadows. Her face was obscured by the darkness, but her glowing eyes pierced through it, fixed on Lily. "I've been waiting for you," Mrs. Everly said softly, her voice lilting and eerie. "You've been marked, Lily. You can't escape now. The curse has already begun." Lily backed away instinctively, her pulse quickening. No, I didn't." She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence. The words didn't matter. She had already crossed a line she could never uncross. "You're mine now," Mrs. Everly whispered, her lips curling into a wicked smile. "And soon you'll be one of us. Forever." Lily's stomach churned as Mrs. Everly took a step forward, her eyes glowing brighter. The shadows around her seemed to shift and twist, creeping like tendrils of darkness. Lily's thoughts swirled, but one thing became clear. She needed to escape. But how? Suddenly, the man who had tried to protect her appeared from the other side of the room, his face still partially shrouded in shadow. He moved quickly, his presence commanding attention as he stepped toward Mrs. Everly. "You can't have her," he said firmly, his voice cold and unwavering. Mrs. Everly froze, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop me?" Her voice was suddenly sharp, like the crack of a whip. "You're too late. I'm not here to stop you," the man replied. "I'm here to save her." Lily's mind raced. Who was this man? How did he know what was happening? More importantly, why was he so confident? "Save me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How? What's going on? What is all of this?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Mrs. Everly with a look of pity. "She's not who you think she is, Lily. She's been using you. The curse, it's not just the book. It's her. She's the source." Mrs. Everly's expression twisted into a cruel sneer. "You can't save her," she spat. "Once the curse has taken hold, it consumes everything." Lily could barely keep up with the exchange. The weight of the words sank in, and she began to understand that she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape from. The house, the curse, Mrs. Everly, all of it was connected, and somehow she had become a part of it. The man stepped closer, his eyes filled with determination. "There's a way out, but we have to act fast." Lily's head was spinning. "What do you mean? What's the way out?" The man hesitated. "The book, the one you touched, is the key, but we need to destroy it." "Destroy it?" Lily repeated, shaking her head. "It's too late. I know," the man interrupted, his voice soft but filled with urgency. "But there's still a chance. The book holds power, but it also has a weakness. If we destroy it, we can break the curse. But we have to act quickly." The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. Lily could feel the curse closing in, suffocating her, threatening to take everything away. "I won't let you take her," the man said to Mrs. Everly, his voice now a low growl. Mrs. Everly's lips parted into a sadistic grin. "You think you can stand against me? I've waited too long for this moment. The room began to tremble as the walls cracked and creaked, the very foundation of the house shaking. Lily's heart raced, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, as if the very house was alive, its walls pulsating with malevolent energy. In the chaos, Lily caught a glimpse of the book on the table, a dark, leather-bound tome that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. It was beckoning her, pulling her closer, and she knew in that moment that it was the source of all the horror she had experienced. The man turned to Lily, his expression fierce and determined. "We need to destroy the book. Now." But before they could make their move, the house groaned in protest. The walls shook violently, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The shadows grew thicker, closing in on them. Lily's blood ran cold as a new figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, dark, and malevolent. It was the creature she had seen before, the one with glowing eyes and twisted, jagged teeth. The curse had taken its final form. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as the room plunged into darkness. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but all she could see were the glowing, malevolent eyes of the creature, burning through the blackness like two red-hot coals. The air was thick with a suffocating pressure, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath her feet. She could hear the creature's low growl reverberating through the walls, each rumble sending a chill down her spine. It was closing in on them, its heavy breathing coming in short, jagged bursts. "Move!" The man's voice cut through the silence like a knife. His hand grabbed hers, pulling her toward the far corner of the room, but her feet felt like they were frozen to the ground. "Lily, now!" The urgency in his voice finally broke through her fear. She snapped to attention, stumbling forward as the man yanked her away from the creature's approaching form. She didn't dare look back. She could feel the tension in the air. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, as if it were waiting for something terrible to unfold. The room was still dark, the only source of light being the faint glow of the creature's eyes. She could hear its claws scraping against the floor, the sound of its movements haunting and predatory. It was getting closer, closer by the second. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room, followed by a low, guttural growl. The man threw himself in front of Lily, his body tense, his fists clenched. "No!" Lily screamed. "Get out of the way!" But it was too late. The creature lunged forward, its massive form crashing into the man with a sickening thud. Lily's stomach churned as she watched the man struggle, his face contorted in pain. The creature's claws dug into his side, blood spilling onto the floor in a dark, grotesque pool. Lily's legs buckled beneath her as she froze, unable to move, unable to help. The man's cries of agony filled the air, but they were drowned out by the creature's relentless growls. "Please!" Lily cried out, her voice breaking. "No! You can't take him! Not like this!" The creature's glowing eyes turned toward her, locking onto her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The house seemed to breathe, and the walls seemed to press in on her from all sides. The man's struggles grew weaker, his body convulsing as the creature's claws tore into him. "Lily, you have to destroy the book." His words were strained, barely a whisper, but they carried a weight that Lily could feel deep in her bones. "What?" Lily gasped, her hands trembling. "What do you mean? How?" "Burn it," the man managed, his voice barely audible. The book is the key." But before Lily could respond, the creature let out a deafening roar. Its eyes blazed, and its massive form surged toward her with terrifying speed. The man's body went limp, and Lily's blood ran cold as she realized what had just happened. He was gone. "No!" she screamed, but the creature was already upon her. it was too late. Lily's heart raced as the creature's clawed hand reached out, but just as it was about to grab her, there was a sudden burst of light, a blinding flash that seemed to come from nowhere. The creature screeched, its body jerking back in pain, as the light grew brighter and brighter. Lily didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away, had to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before her. As she ran, her eyes locked onto the object she had seen earlier, the book. It sat on the table, glowing ominously, as though it were calling her. She could feel its pull, the weight of its curse bearing down on her. Without thinking, she rushed toward it. Her fingers wrapped around the leather-bound cover, and for a brief moment, she felt the surge of power radiating from it, almost like the book was alive. The creature growled in the darkness, its steps coming closer again. But Lily didn't stop. She ripped the book from the table, holding it in her hands with trembling fingers. Her mind screamed at her to open it, to find a way to end this once and for all. But fear gnawed at her. What if the book was the source of all the evil? What if opening it would only make things worse? But the man's words echoed in her mind. The book is the key. With a final, desperate breath, Lily flipped the book open. The pages felt cold against her fingers, like they had been frozen in time. She could feel the weight of every word written on the page, as though they had been etched into her soul. Her eyes scanned the words, but they made no sense. They were written in a language she didn't understand. Suddenly, the room seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the light dimmed. Shadows began to stretch and twist in impossible ways, reaching out toward her like dark hands. The creature roared again, and Lily's grip on the book tightened. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know how to stop it. But the creature was getting closer, its eyes burning through the shadows. I have to end this. I have to stop it. Lily turned the page, hoping to find something, anything that could save her. But the moment she did, everything changed. The walls began to crack, the very foundation of the house shaking beneath her feet. The shadows that had been creeping toward her suddenly lunged forward, reaching for her with claws that were far too real. She stumbled back, but it was too late. The creature was upon her again, its claws closing around her throat, its hot breath searing her skin. Lily gasped for air, struggling against the creature's grip, but she couldn't break free. The book slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a loud thud. And then, in a flash of light, everything stopped. Lily blinked rapidly, her heart pounding in her chest as the world around her began to shift. One moment, she had been trapped in the suffocating grip of the creature. The next, she was standing in an open field bathed in an eerie twilight glow. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, as though something ancient and forgotten had awakened. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her feet sinking slightly into the cold, wet ground beneath her. The sky above was thick with dark clouds, swirling in unnatural patterns, as if the very atmosphere was trying to reject her presence. In the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of a large, decrepit house, its windows dark and uninviting. It looked like the house from her neighbor's street, the one she had visited earlier. But this place, this version of it, was different. It was twisted, corrupted. Lily's stomach churned as she took a step forward, her senses on high alert. Something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of dread that made every hair on her body stand up. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her, almost like the earth was alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. She wanted to turn and run, but she couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the spot, and her hands, which had once gripped the cursed book, now hung limply by her sides. As she stood there, struggling to comprehend what had just happened, she heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was low, like a soft murmur, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Lily." She froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The voice seemed to come from all around her, echoing in the empty field. It was neither male nor female, yet it felt familiar and terrifying. "Lily, you are not alone." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she spun around, her eyes searching the darkened landscape for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No figure, no shape, just the oppressive silence of the empty field. Her breath was shallow, the air thick with tension. The book, still clutched in her hand, seemed to grow heavier, as if it was a weight she couldn't escape from. She glanced down at it, her mind racing with questions. What was happening? Where was she? And most importantly, how could she escape this nightmare? The wind picked up again, swirling around her, and the shadows of the house in the distance seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her like fingers reaching for her very soul. A sudden realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She had been transported to another world, a world that was somehow tied to the book. The curse had taken her here, to this twisted version of reality, and it was clear that she was not meant to be here. Not alive, anyway. The whisper came again, louder this time, like a hissing voice in her ear. "The book is not your salvation. It is your doom." Lily staggered back, the words crashing into her like a wave. The weight of the book in her hands felt suffocating, like it was trying to pull her under. She had thought she could end this nightmare by opening the book, but it seemed to have done the opposite. It had bound her to this place, and now there was no way out. "Burn it," the voice whispered again, and Lily's hands tightened around the book. The words echoed in her mind, growing louder, until they drowned out all other thoughts. Burn it and end this nightmare. She glanced down at the book, her mind torn. She didn't know what the book truly contained, but she had to believe that this was the way out. It had to be. There was no other choice. The whispers seemed to grow more urgent, more insistent. "Burn it, Lily." With trembling hands, she opened the book again. The pages flicked quickly under her fingers, each one soaked in dark energy, until she found a passage that seemed to shimmer on its own, as if it were waiting for her. It was written in a strange, cryptic language, one that she had never seen before, yet the words seemed to make sense in her mind. There was a part of her that understood them, understood the power they held. She could feel the energy inside her, dark and dangerous, swirling around her, tugging at her very soul. Without another thought, she tore the page from the book, feeling its power pulse through her as the paper slipped through her fingers. She looked up at the house again, the dark shadows stretching toward her like claws, and then back down at the page in her hand. The wind howled, the shadows closing in on her, but Lily didn't hesitate. With a cry, she set the page alight, watching as the flames devoured it, the dark energy dissipating into the air like smoke. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and the world seemed to shatter. The house in the distance trembled, its walls groaning and twisting as if in agony. The whispers grew louder, becoming screams. Screams that were all around her, that came from inside her own head, from deep within the earth itself. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, the flames flickering and dying, the page turning to ash in her hands. The ground beneath her cracked open wider, and from the dark abyss below, something emerged. Something monstrous. She could hear it before she saw it. The sound of something heavy, something with purpose, dragging itself across the earth. Then she saw it. A figure emerged from the ground, rising from the very cracks in the earth. It was a twisted, monstrous version of the man she had seen before, her neighbor. His face was contorted, his eyes wide and crazed, filled with a dark, empty void. His body was twisted, almost as if the earth itself had reshaped him into something unrecognizable. He grinned at her, his teeth sharp and jagged. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, his voice a low growl that rumbled in her chest. "You've sealed your fate, Lily." The world around her seemed to bend, the sky darkening, the ground shifting. She was no longer in the field. She was back in the cursed house, standing in the center of the darkened room, the book lying in front of her. The book was glowing now, its pages alive with malevolent energy. Lily's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The curse wasn't just on the book, it was on everything, and she had only made it worse. Lily's heart raced as she turned and bolted toward the nearest exit, her breath ragged in her chest. The twisted figure of her neighbor, no longer human, no longer anything she could recognize, loomed behind her. Every step she took seemed to make the walls around her close in tighter, as if the house itself was alive, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into its dark heart. The floor beneath her feet creaked with each step, the groan of the old wood echoing through the eerily silent house. Lily's mind was a blur, a whirlwind of thoughts and terror. She didn't know where to go, didn't know what she was running from, except the thing that had once been her neighbor. Now something far worse. It was following her, its footsteps a hollow thump, a promise of doom. The air in the house was thick with the scent of damp earth, the same oppressive stench she had felt in the cursed field. Each breath felt like a struggle. She could hear it, an unsettling sound, like a whisper, faint but growing louder with every passing second. "You can't escape." The words were in her head, but they didn't sound like her own thoughts. They felt foreign, twisted. Her mind screamed at her to get out of the house, to escape whatever nightmare had taken root here. But there was no escape. Not now. She found herself running down the hallway, hands frantically searching the walls for a door, a window, anything. The house seemed to stretch on forever. The darkened rooms mocked her, their shadows moving like living things. Each room she passed felt colder, colder than the last, like the temperature was dropping with every step she took. Then, ahead of her, she saw it. A small door at the end of the hall, almost invisible in the dim light. Hope flared in her chest, and without hesitation, she sprinted toward it. She yanked the door open with a force she didn't know she had, but what she saw on the other side made her blood run cold. It wasn't an exit. It was a staircase leading down into a dark, endless void. The very air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural darkness. It was like looking into the heart of the house, the place where everything began. But there was nowhere else to go. Her only choice was to descend, to find whatever truth lay buried below the surface of the house, and of her neighbor's twisted secret. With trembling hands, she stepped down the first stair, the wood creaking beneath her feet. The darkness swallowed her whole, the only sound the pounding of her heart and the echo of her footsteps. The deeper she went, the colder it became. Her breath misted in front of her face, and the walls seemed to close in tighter. She could feel something watching her, something far older than the house itself, far older than the twisted neighbor. The house seemed to have a mind of its own, breathing, pulsing, waiting. The steps led her to a small, cramped room at the bottom of the stairs. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the stone, as if someone or something had scratched them there in a desperate frenzy. The center of the room held an altar, stone and cold, stained with something dark and sticky. Her stomach lurched, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. At the foot of the altar, A large, weathered book lay open, its pages yellowed with age. The book, the very one she had been searching for, the source of all of this. It was calling to her. Lily hesitated for only a moment before her feet moved on their own, carrying her forward. The closer she got, the more the room seemed to tremble, the more the symbols on the walls seemed to shift and writhe. As she stood before the altar, she reached out to touch the book, her fingers brushing against the pages. A jolt of cold shot up her spine, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. Her heart skipped a beat, and in that moment she understood. This wasn't just a book. It was a gateway to something ancient, something dark, something that could never be undone. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing her in. Lily spun around, panic rising in her chest as she realized she was trapped. The room was getting darker. The symbols on the walls were glowing now, their eerie light casting long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch toward her. The whispers in her mind grew louder, becoming a chorus of voices, none of them human. "It's too late, Lily." The voice sounded like the one from the field, the one that had told her to burn the book. But now there was no question of burning it. It had already consumed her. "The curse is in you now, and it will never let you go." Lily backed away from the altar, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't think straight. The room felt smaller, tighter, and the walls were closing in. The whispers surrounded her, disorienting her, driving her to the brink of madness. The creature, her neighbor, appeared in the doorway, his twisted form blocking her only escape. He grinned at her, his eyes filled with malice. "You should never have opened the book," he hissed, his voice a low growl. "Now you are one of us." Lily turned her back on him, desperate for a way out. She grabbed the book again, her hands shaking violently. The pages fluttered open, as though it had a life of its own, its dark energy pulling her in. Suddenly, she felt it. A sharp pain in her chest, like ice spreading through her veins. She gasped for breath, her vision blurring as the room spun around her. The curse was taking hold, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her mind spun into chaos. She was losing herself, losing her grip on reality. But then, amidst the pain, a single thought pierced through the haze. "There is a way out." The whisper was faint but clear. Promise, a possibility. Lily wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but she clung to it, desperate. She had to find it. She had to find the truth. And somehow she had to break free. Lily's pulse raced as the creature lunged forward, its dark, twisted figure reaching out with hands that seemed too long, too sharp. Her mind was fogged with fear, the overwhelming energy of the book pulsating through her veins like a heartbeat of its own. The air around her thickened, and the walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing down on her with a suffocating weight. She could feel it, the curse. It was no longer just in the book. It was in her, sinking deeper with every passing second, wrapping itself around her soul, squeezing tighter, as if it was consuming her from the inside out. She gasped for air, but the suffocating sensation only grew worse. The creature's grin widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, like a predator closing in on its prey. "It's too late for you," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You've already joined us. You will become like me." Lily's vision blurred, her body trembling with the weight of the curse. The book in her hands seemed to burn with a cold fire, its pages flipping wildly as though alive, as though it wanted to tear itself from her grasp. "No, you can't." A sudden thought flickered through her mind, as if a last gasp of sanity in the midst of the madness. The whisper she had heard before, "There is a way out." The words echoed in her mind, a faint lifeline. Her hands were shaking, but she held the book tighter. The creature was getting closer, its twisted form moving with unnatural speed. But she couldn't afford to waste another second. With trembling fingers, she tore the pages of the book, ripping them one by one, scattering them into the air like confetti. The room shuddered as if the house itself was alive, a deep rumble vibrating through the floor beneath her feet. The creature snarled, its eyes flashing with rage, but Lily couldn't stop. She tore the pages faster, the dark energy in the room growing more intense, more suffocating. The book, the source of the curse, was falling apart in her hands. She didn't know what she was doing, didn't know if it would work, but she had to try. She had to stop the curse from taking her, from taking anyone else. This is my only chance. The last page of the book was crumbling in her hands, but just as she was about to rip it, the creature lunged forward, its claws sharp and deadly. It grabbed her by the wrist, its grip like iron, pulling her toward its hideous face. "No, I won't let you take me." Lily twisted in its grasp, her body screaming with the effort, and in one desperate, final movement, she thrust the book toward the creature's face. As if in slow motion, the pages of the book fluttered and caught fire, flames licking up from the edges. The creature's scream was deafening, a raw, guttural wail that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Its skin burned, blackened and cracked, as the fire consumed it. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh, and Lily's stomach churned with the horrific sound. She could feel the heat radiating off the creature, but she held her ground, refusing to look away. Then, with a final scream, the creature crumbled to ash, disintegrating into the air like dust. The room seemed to breathe again, the darkness that had clung to the walls dissipating in an instant. Lily collapsed to her knees, her body shaking violently, her chest heaving for breath. The fire that had consumed the creature was gone, leaving only the scent of burnt wood and the echo of silence. The book, now nothing but charred remains, lay at her feet. She had done it. She had destroyed the curse. But even as she sat there, the weight of the events slowly sinking in, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The house, once alive with the energy of the curse, was eerily silent now, but it wasn't empty. There was something in the air, something lingering, just out of reach. Lily stood, wiping the sweat from her brow, and took one last look around the room. The altar was gone. The symbols on the walls faded to nothing. The darkness had lifted, but the price had been high. It was over, but the scar it had left would never fade. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and Lily hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure what she would find beyond it, but she knew she had to leave. The house had claimed so much of her already. She couldn't stay any longer. With trembling hands, she ascended the stairs, stepping into the hallway, which was now bathed in pale, fragile light. The house was still old, but it felt different, emptier, as if the evil that had once inhabited it had been driven out. As she reached the front door, her heart sank. The key to her freedom was now in her hand, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Lily stepped outside, her feet crunching on the gravel driveway, and turned for one final look at the house. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful, the air cool against her skin, the quiet of the night settling around her. But then, as she glanced back at the window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The faintest shadow moved behind the glass, as if someone or something was standing there, watching her. Impossible. She turned quickly, walking away from the house with quick steps. But as she walked, her heart pounded in her chest. Was the curse truly gone? Or had it simply moved on, found a new host, a new victim? The answer, she knew, was one she might never find. But for now, she had escaped. She had survived. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lily took a breath that didn't feel like it was suffocating her.